December 1943, Eastern Front. A German artillery officer watches his guns. He has been at this for 3 years. Russia, North Africa, France. He knows artillery. His guns are accurate, methodical, deadly. His crews can place a shell within 50 meters of any target. They survey the ground with transits. They calculate wind, temperature, barrel wear. It takes 30 minutes to prepare a fire mission, but when they fire, they hit what they aim at. This is German artillery doctrine: precision over speed, quality over quantity. And for 3 years, it has worked. Then the Americans arrived in Europe, and everything this officer knew about artillery became obsolete in 3 minutes. Let me tell you what German officers really thought about American artillery, not what propaganda said, not what history books claim, what they actually wrote in their field reports, in their letters home, in their interrogation transcripts after capture. This is about the weapon system that terrified the Wehrmacht more than any other, more than tanks, more than aircraft, more than the atomic bomb. German soldiers called it mathematical murder. They called it automatic guns. They called it impossible, and they were right to be terrified.
The German army in 1943 possessed some of the finest artillery in the world. The famous 88mm gun, the 105mm howitzer, the Nebelwerfer rocket launcher. German artillery officers were professionals, academy-trained, experts in ballistics. They understood the mathematics of death. Their system was built on precision. Before firing, German artillery crews surveyed their positions. They used optical instruments to measure exact distances to landmarks. They created detailed firing tables accounting for every variable: temperature, air pressure, wind direction, powder temperature, barrel erosion. A German battery could place a shell with remarkable accuracy, 50 meters from target, sometimes closer. But all that precision came with a cost: time. A German fire mission from request to impact took 30 to 45 minutes, sometimes longer. The forward observer had to identify the target, radio back to battalion headquarters. The Fire Direction Center had to calculate firing data, consult the tables, account for all variables. Then the guns had to be aimed, manually adjusted for elevation and traverse. Only then could they fire. It was artillery warfare as practiced since Napoleon: slow, methodical, deliberate. And against the British and French, it worked well enough. Then the Americans showed up with a completely different idea.
Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 1935. While the German army was perfecting its precision system, American artillery officers were working on something else entirely: speed. They weren't trying to build more accurate guns. They were trying to build a faster system. Between the World Wars, artillery officers at Fort Sill developed something revolutionary. They called it graphical fire direction. Here's how it worked. Instead of calculating every fire mission from scratch, they pre-computed thousands of firing solutions for every combination of temperature, wind, elevation, and barrel wear imaginable. They put all this data on paper tapes. When a fire mission came in, the fire direction officer didn't calculate. He just went to a filing cabinet, pulled out the correct tape for current conditions, laid it on a map between the battery position and the target, read the firing data directly off the tape. 3 minutes from call to impact. The German system was more accurate, but the American system was 10 times faster. And in combat, speed kills. The Americans made another critical decision in the 1930s. They motorized their artillery completely. German artillery was still pulled by horses, tens of thousands of horses. American guns were towed by trucks. The M5 high-speed tractor, the Mack NR, the Diamond T. An American artillery battalion could road march 160 miles in a single day. A German battalion managed maybe 20 miles if the weather was good. This mobility created something the Germans had never seen before: massed fires, on demand, from guns that weren't even assigned to your sector.
If you were an American infantry company under attack, you could call for artillery support. Your battalion's 105mm howitzers would respond in 3 minutes. But you could also request division artillery. That added 3 more minutes, the 155mm long tom guns. Need more? Corps artillery, another 3 minutes. Now you had the 8-inch guns, the 240mm howitzers. 9 minutes from your initial call to having the firepower of an entire corps landing on your target. The Germans had no answer for this. German artillery was parceled out to specific sectors, assigned to specific units, controlled by commanders who needed written orders to shift fires. American artillery was a fluid resource. Any battery in range could fire for any unit that needed support. One American artillery spotter in Italy called in 5 separate corps-level fire missions in 1 hour. 5 different times he identified a target, radioed the coordinates, and within minutes dozens of guns from different battalions converged their fire on that single point. This was artillery as an industrial system, not a craft, not an art, a machine for producing casualties at scale. And then the Americans introduced something that made German officers think they were hallucinating: time on target. Normandy, July 1944. A German company is dug in, waiting for the American attack. They know American artillery will fire. They've experienced it before. The shells come in waves. You have a few seconds after the first impact to dive for cover, get in your foxhole, put your helmet on. Casualties in artillery attacks happen in the first few seconds. After that, soldiers are prone, in cover. Survival rate goes up 66%. The Germans knew this. Every army knew this. So the Germans are ready. First shell hits, they're diving for cover. But this time, the first shell doesn't hit alone. 50 shells hit, simultaneously, in a 3-second window. The German company ceases to exist. This was time on target, TOT, the uniquely American ability to coordinate multiple artillery batteries to fire so that all rounds impact the target at exactly the same moment. Here's how it worked. A target is identified. Forward observer calls it in. The Fire Direction Center broadcasts the mission to every battery in range. But they don't just tell them to fire. They tell them when the rounds must impact, specific time, down to the second. Each battery calculates how long their shells will take to reach the target. Time of flight varies. Some guns are closer, some farther, different elevation angles. So each battery fires at a different time. The closest batteries fire last. The farthest batteries fire first. But all the shells arrive together. Dozens of guns, firing at different times, from different positions, all coordinated so their shells converge on a single point within a 3-second window. The mathematical precision required for this was extraordinary, and the Germans had nothing like it. German artillery officers didn't believe it was possible when they first encountered it. They thought the Americans had some kind of automatic gun system, machines that fired impossibly fast. German prisoners would ask to see the automatic artillery. They couldn't comprehend that human crews were doing this, with radios, with pre-computed firing tables, with sheer organizational efficiency. One German officer, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, told interrogators, "Your artillery is not artillery. It is something else. It is mathematical murder." That phrase appeared in multiple German reports. Mathematical murder. Not heroic, not brave, not honorable warfare. Just mathematics, applied at industrial scale to kill the maximum number of Germans in the minimum amount of time. Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Germany's last major offensive. Hitler's attempt to split the Allied lines, recapture of Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. The attack began with artillery. German guns pounded American positions, rockets, mortars, the Nebelwerfer's distinctive shriek. It was effective. But then the weather cleared, and American artillery began to respond. At Elsenborn Ridge, the Americans assembled almost 350 guns, one of the largest artillery concentrations in the history of warfare. The 6th SS Panzer Army attacked into it.
What happened next entered German military legend as a cautionary tale. The German advance stalled, not because of American infantry, not because of American tanks, because German soldiers refused to move forward through the artillery fire. Officers reported entire companies taking cover and refusing orders. NCOs reported soldiers crying, shaking, urinating themselves. Not because they were cowards, because the mathematical probability of surviving an advance through American artillery was approaching zero. One German regimental commander wrote in his after-action report, "We are facing not an army, but a factory. They manufacture death at a speed we cannot counter." At Bastogne, American artillery saved the 101st Airborne. The Germans surrounded the town, demanded surrender. General McAleef replied, "Nuts." But what really stopped the German attack wasn't American stubbornness, it was American artillery. African-American artillery battalions, the 969th, the 333rd, regular white artillery units. They poured fire onto every German advance, 10,000 rounds in 8 hours during one attack. German survivors described it as a steel curtain. You couldn't advance through it, you couldn't retreat through it, you just died in it. The Rhine Crossing, March 1945. Generals Simpson and Eisenhower stood on the west bank of the Rhine, watching the artillery preparation. 2,070 American guns. All along the flat plains on the western bank, you could see the muzzle flashes, one after another, like a string of firecrackers that stretched for miles. 1,000 rounds per minute, 65,000 rounds total. It was the largest artillery barrage in American military history. On the German side, survivors later described it as the end of the world. Not an attack, not a battle, just obliteration. German commanders tried to organize counterattacks, tried to move reinforcements, tried to establish defensive lines. They couldn't. Every time a German unit tried to move, American spotter planes saw them. Within minutes, artillery fire landed on them. The German 12th SS Panzer Division was supposed to counterattack. They never made it to the front line. American artillery destroyed them during their approach march, just erased them. That's what the Americans had built. Not an artillery arm, an industrial system for destroying armies. The Germans called it other things too, not just mathematical murder. They called it the hammer. The 12th Corps artillery was described as the hammer that drove the steel spikes of the 12th Corps into the coffin of the Third Reich. They called it the automatic artillery because they couldn't believe humans were firing that fast. One German officer wrote, "Against the British, you can be brave. Against the Russians, you can be fanatic. Against the Americans, you can only be dead." Let me tell you what made American artillery so devastating. It wasn't just the guns. The Germans had good guns, sometimes better guns. It was the system. American artillery had 5 components working together. Miss any one of them, and the whole system fails. First, accurate maps. The Americans brought detailed maps of Europe, maps showing individual farm buildings, roads, bridges, everything gridded with mathematical precision. German maps were often inaccurate, based on pre-war surveys, missing recent changes to terrain. Second, communication. Every American artillery unit had radio. Every forward observer had radio. They could call in fire missions instantly, coordinate with other units, shift fires in seconds. German artillery still relied heavily on telephone lines, easily cut by shelling, by aircraft, by advancing infantry. Third, mobility. American trucks. The Germans captured American trucks whenever they could. Even German Field Marshal von Manstein commented on how American trucks increased the mobility of Soviet artillery after they were shipped to Russia via Lend-Lease. German horses couldn't match truck speed, couldn't march as far, needed food and water, got sick, died. Fourth, ammunition supply. The Americans made artillery shells like they made everything else, in staggering quantities. The Lake City Army ammunition plant in Missouri was operated by women, housewives, factory girls. They made millions of rounds, more ammunition than the German army fired in entire campaigns. And finally, the human element, training. Every American artillery officer trained at Fort Sill. They all learned the same system, used the same procedures, spoke the same language. A forward observer from New York could call in fire from a battery in Texas, and they'd understand each other perfectly. German artillery used different procedures in different commands, sometimes different procedures between divisions. This standardization meant any American battery could fire for any American unit instantly, without confusion. The Germans couldn't match this. Not because German soldiers were inferior, they weren't. German artillery crews were professionals, skilled, dedicated. But they were fighting an industrial system with artisan methods, like a blacksmith competing with Ford Motor Company.
After the war, the U.S. Army studied the effectiveness of every branch of service: infantry, armor, Air Force, engineers, logistics. The artillery received the highest marks, time and time again, not because they were braver, not because they suffered more casualties, not because their individual guns were better, because they killed more enemy soldiers per dollar spent than any other branch. The arithmetic of death. German officers understood this by 1945, in their post-war memoirs, in their interrogations, in their letters. They didn't blame German artillery crews, they blamed the mismatch. One German general wrote, "We brought artists to a factory fight." Another wrote, "Against the Americans, every German advantage vanished under their artillery. Our superior tactics meant nothing. Our veteran soldiers meant nothing. We were simply drowned in shells." A German company commander captured in April 1945 told his interrogators something revealing. He said, "When we hear British artillery, we take cover and wait. When we hear Russian artillery, we take cover and pray. When we hear American artillery, we give up. There is no answer to it. You cannot be brave enough. You cannot dig deep enough. You can only hope they miss." They rarely missed. This wasn't secret information. German high command knew about American artillery capabilities. They'd seen after-action reports, read interrogation transcripts, studied captured American fire direction manuals. But knowing about it and countering it were different things. To match American artillery, Germany would have needed to do what America did in the 1930s, completely redesign their system, retrain every officer, motorize every gun, create an industrial supply chain for ammunition. By 1944, Germany couldn't do any of that. They were short on trucks, short on fuel, short on rubber for tires, short on ammunition, short on everything except soldiers and willingness to die. So German commanders adapted, or tried to. They stopped concentrating forces because American artillery destroyed concentrations. They moved only at night because American spotter planes called in daylight artillery. They dug deeper, built thicker bunkers, spread out more. But all of that was defensive, reactive. It didn't stop American artillery. It just reduced casualties from unsurvivable to merely catastrophic. And it slowed German operations, made them less effective, forced them to fight the way Americans wanted them to fight, which was the point.
The Americans didn't invent artillery. They didn't even invent most of their guns. The 105mm howitzer was based on a 1920s design. The 155 used French principles. But they industrialized artillery. They took a weapon system that had existed for 500 years and rebuilt it on American principles. Speed over precision, volume over accuracy, system over skill. They took advantage of America's strengths, industrial capacity, trucks, radios, standardized training, detailed maps. And they created something the Germans couldn't counter. Not because the Germans were stupid, they weren't. German officers were among the best military minds in the world, but because the Germans were fighting an economy, not an army.
Every shell fired at German positions was stamped out by American factories, shipped across the Atlantic by American ships, delivered to the front by American trucks, fired by American crews. And behind every crew was a supply chain that could replace every round fired. Germany was fighting with shells they had in stock. When those ran out, they were done. America was fighting with shells they were making that morning. That's what German officers really thought about American artillery. It wasn't fair, it wasn't honorable, it wasn't even military in the traditional sense. It was industrial warfare, applied mathematics, mass production of death, and there was no answer to it. That's why when German prisoners of war were asked what weapon they feared most, artillery was always the answer. Not tanks, not aircraft, not flamethrowers. Artillery. American artillery. The weapon system that turned World War II into a mathematical equation, and Germany was always going to lose that equation. Because you can't outproduce the country that outproduces everybody. American artillery units killed more enemy soldiers than any other branch of the U.S. military. General Patton said it plainly, "We won the war, and it was largely won by the artillery." Not the boldest claim, not the most heroic statement, just the truth. Mathematical murder, a hammer that broke the Wehrmacht. That's what American artillery was, and that's what German officers really thought about it.